Here's a segment from a recent Gun Talk Radio episode. You can listen to all the Gun Talk Radio podcasts however you tune in, or check out guntalk.com for more. And speaking of media coverage, you know what's been going on. When it comes to mainstream media, you know you're not getting the real story. It's hard because there are so very few news reporters. It's almost all news repeaters. Whatever the New York Times or the Washington Post says gets repeated as gospel. And of course, they get their talking points, at least on our issue, from the gun ban industry. There is, however, a journalist, a real reporter out there who has worked for a lot of different media, mainstream media outlets. I'm talking about NBC, ABC News, also Fox, OAN, the Washington Times. It's Emily Miller joins us right now. Emily, thank you for being here.
Oh, Tom, it's always a pleasure.
So, okay, you're a D.C. insider. You're in Washington, D.C. You've been in and of that city. You're working at some of the agencies there, working at the highest levels, reporting on things. And as you said on your website, and it has gotten you in trouble from time to time, has it not?
Yes, it has. Being in Washington, D.C. is a crazy place, I'll tell you.
Well, okay, for those of us who are not there, and thank God it's been a long, long, long time since I worked in D.C., it's a company town, is it not?
Yes, I mean, everyone's in politics in some way. And people outside D.C. say, oh, it's so divided, and we need to go back to those times when we had worked together and had bipartisanship. I can tell you, there has never been bipartisanship in this city. You're either Democrat or Republican. You toe the party line, and there is absolute corruption, and it's been the same way it has always been.
I like that phrase, absolute corruption. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think a lot of people who are elected to office come with truly care and want to make a difference. The problem is they get in office and they need to raise money, or they start going to nice parties and they start to become more famous. They're on TV more often. They've got a big staff, and they become corrupt. And I'm not saying all of them break the law, but the egos get big. The time that they spend back in their districts, back in their home states, gets less and less. The time they spend with lobbyists becomes more and more. And it's, very rare to find a pure-hearted elected official over time in Washington, D.C.
Eventually they sell out and become part of the industry. And like I say, it is an industry there. And you're right. I mean, it splits on Republicans and Democrats. I have a friend who was in the voiceover business, and he said, you're either working one side of the street or the other. You can't work for both sides. So he did ads for the Democrats. He says, but there was no way to do ads for the Republicans. Of course, now, he also said, I took all their money and then I bought more guns. So there's that.
It's true. And actually, I find it to be somewhat of a shame, that it is for just people who are just doing, tactical things, selling ads, doing voiceover work. It's one side or the other. That's just how the world works here in Washington. It's you can't work for both sides.
How do you avoid? I mean, you've been at the largest media companies. You've reported for, NBC, ABC, Fox. How do you navigate that and end up where you are now?
Well, I started my career in what we would now call mainstream media, liberal media. Back then, it was just called media. My first job was at NBC News, and I, answered phones. I was took the mail around, handed out newspapers, and I was in College Republicans when I started right after college. I started interning when I was at Georgetown. Started working at NBC News, the network in Washington bureau. Graduated and got a job there. As I said, very entry level at the beginning, and I was in College Republicans. I was a Republican. I was probably one of 4 out of 100. But because I was a kid, nobody really, they more made fun of me or asked questions, but they didn't. It wasn't resentful. It wasn't dismissive. It wasn't arrogant. And then as I moved up in what was again called media back then, and now is liberal media or mainstream media and ABC News. I worked for the Sunday Show this week with David Brinkley, and I got really lucky because the executive producer was a conservative and a Republican, and so I found this really cool niche in the network where I was allowed to be a conservative Republican and do it working on this big important Sunday show. Sam Donaldson and Cookie Roberts were then the anchors after David Brinkley was the anchor. And obviously they're were extremely liberal. But I was the booker for the show and I was the one who got the guests. I was the associate producer. So, and I think because the producer wanted balance. And so he had balance in the staff, he had balance in the set, and he had balance on the anchors.
Okay. But is that all gone now?
Totally gone. It doesn't exist anymore. None of those people work there anymore. I can say on, because I worked there, as a conservative Republican, I worked in mainstream media, I can say there's an extreme bias. It is 90%, I'd say, liberal. And the problem with it is that they won't admit it. And that's how their bias comes out in the media, is that they consider themselves neutral, but they're all liberal. And so, later I ended up working in politics in Republican. I worked on Capitol Hill in the State Department. And so once that was over, I was no longer allowed to go back to liberal media because I was openly Republican, whereas somebody like George Stephanopoulos, someone who was a liberal, worked for the White House, is allowed to be the mainstream anchor. So Republicans are not allowed to go back. Democrats are allowed to go back into the media because it is all liberal. It truly is. And now it's always been that way. It's nothing going to change. But now there's so many alternatives and there's so many conservative outlets where you can actually get different kinds of stories.
But you have to work at it. You have to work at it. And Fox is not conservative anymore. I mean, I see them parroting the talking points of the gun ban lobby. And so many times on Fox News, what we get is they're giving the numbers out from the Gun Violence Archive, which is a completely bogus organization, of course.
Yes.
And it's just like I'm thinking, what happened to Fox News? Now they've become this mouthpiece for the gun ban industry.
Well, I watch Fox. I mean, I think they're the best journalists on the right, on television on the right. But as far as the gun issue, I totally seen the switch, and it drives me absolutely crazy. All these outlets that use gun violence archives, or whatever the project is, that cites mass shootings as anybody who was shot and not killed, which is not the FBI definition. I mean, it's just a fact. And I've written about them and looked into their numbers. I mean, credible. There are a few I will say, there are some of the more credible news liberal outlets, like the Washington Post, still and AP will still only use 4 or more people who are killed in a mass shooting. Some of them. But you have to know which ones they are. And like you said, that's really hard for the average person to go searching to figure out when you say mass shooting, which is used all the time now, when they just refer to more than one person being shot as a mass shooting.
Or typically a gang, and they call gang shootings mass shootings, which is not what they are. That's not the FBI definition.
Because it's a crime issue. It's not this one-off. And the other thing, it really bothers me that all media do it, use these bigger numbers on mass shootings and refer to everything as mass shootings. People are terrified. I was just talking to one of my girlfriends yesterday at lunch, and she's like, I don't want my kids in school. I'm so scared something's going to happen. And I said, your kids are totally safe at school. I mean, it's extremely rare, less than 100 people a year to be in a mass shooting. And I could barely get this it took a long time to talk it through. And I try to do that publicly as well, is to explain to people, and I've written multiple stories when actually mass shootings are, which is 4 or more people who are killed who are not known to the shooter in a public place.
Right.
That's what it is. Like what happened in Nashville at the Christian school is a mass shooting. It was horrific and horrible. Or what happened at the bank in Memphis recently, that's a mass shooting. That's horrible. But your kids are safe in school. It's very rare. You're safe to go to a bank. It's extremely rare. When I say to people, it trends back and forth over the years, but it's almost never been over 100 people a year. And they can't believe it because it's on the news every night.
Right. That's what they're bombarded with daily. Emily, hold on a second here. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back. I want to talk about Donald Trump and guns. You covered that. If you want to see more about what Emily is writing about, and it's excellent. She, of course, is the author of Emily Gets Her Gun, which is fabulous. Emily Post News. That's EmilyPostNews.com. We'll be right back with more Gun Talk. We're talking with Emily Miller. She is an award-winning journalist, reporter, the author of the book Emily Gets Her Gun. And really, Emily, with that book and with your journey, your quest, if you will, to get a carry permit in D.C., you showed a lot of people what normal people have to go through to get a permit there back then, and actually changed a lot of things through that.
Yeah, actually, I got the laws changed in D.C. For owning a gun. I don't know if you remember back when I had never shot a gun before, just to remind for people who've never heard of me before. I had never shot a gun, and I had been a victim of, I was house sitting for a friend, dog sitting, and some man came in and into the house and robbed me, and I came back. I walked in on this. Long story. I tweeted and I said, I'm thinking about getting a gun. And all these people kept saying, you can't, you live in Washington, D.C. And I thought, well, I know the Heller decision, is out. I know we're supposed to be able to. So I decided I was going to try to get one. And I worked for the Washington Times at that point, and I said to my editor, I'm going to get a gun. I'm going to try to get a gun. I don't know what it's going to take. I don't know anything about it. And he said, okay, well, you still have to write your op-ed every day, so do it in your free time. So I didn't even get time off for this. In the end, what happened is just to D.C. is the only place, I think Hawaii is the only other place that has what's called has an actual registration, and people sort of don't believe me. I'm like, every gun that you own in D.C. legally is registered with the police department, and you get a separate registration with the serial number, with the card for everyone. That's just ownership. That's not to take it out of the house. The government knows every single gun you own legally. If you're a criminal, you don't do this.
Right.
So when I went through this, and I did it publicly, and I kept writing about it, and people couldn't believe it, it was something like 15 steps it took. It took about 4 months just to register one gun.
Wow.
And it made the city realize pretty quickly, as it was becoming more public, that they were about to get sued. So I worked with them a little bit, and they made the registration laws less onerous, but it didn't go away. So it is easier to get a gun. And then, of course, over the years, I then wrote about getting a carry permit, and that all went through the courts, and D.C. became a shall-issue state even before Bruin. And so I was quite pleased to get my carry permit in D.C. in a place where 10 years earlier, pre-Heller, you couldn't even own a gun. It's just, the D.C. laws are so ridiculous.
You're stubborn, aren't you?
But now it's like better than, New York. It's easier to carry. It still has a cost, 17 hours of training.
Yeah. Let me jump in here. Because you've written about Donald Trump and guns, and we've got a lot of folks who say, yeah, Trump is great on guns, and I keep saying, no, actually he's not. He he leans a little bit our way when it's convenient to him, but when he gets pushed at all, he goes to his New York liberal roots, doesn't he?
He does. And look, I interviewed Donald Trump in 2012 about guns. I spent about an hour in a hotel room in Florida with Melania and Donald Trump talking about this. And so I can tell you firsthand, he had I asked him about his carry permit in New York. I asked him what he carried, said he'd never told anyone before. So he legitimately has a carry permit. This is 2012. Right. Has a carry permit, has guns. So he is not anti-guns. I want to just start with that because people are freaking out about my story.
Okay.
But he is not an absolutist on the Second Amendment. He never has been. He's just, you're right. He's from New York. He doesn't know, his sons are hunters. Yes, they are big gun owners. Yes, they're absolutely big pro-gun people. He's not personally. And his instincts are more liberal New York, which is where he's from and where he grew up. So my story was based on the Washington Post story. And this is not my source. This is the Washington Post. But the Washington Post did this 6-part series on ARs. Like, they are obsessed with ARs. That's what the whole series is about. It's not about Donald Trump. They're just obsessed with ARs. Mm-hmm. Buried in it is this story about when Donald Trump was president. He, in the first 2 years, it was after a mass shooting. I'm trying to remember which one it was, but he said, I don't know why anybody can own an AR. Why anyone should own an AR. We've all heard that a million times from people, like, especially non-gun owners don't know why anyone needs, because they think it's an automatic firearm.
Right.
And in the Washington Post story, I probably would not have repeated it if the Washington Post had, on the record, talked to Donald Trump's spokesman, his current presidential campaign spokesman, who did not deny it. And they also had 5 sources. So he said it. He didn't do anything about it, but apparently he said it repeatedly in the first 2 years.
Well, now, he also said, take the guns and worry about due process later.
He's not been an absolutist on the Second Amendment. And we also have seen on video in his first 2 years when Senator Dianne Feinstein said, will you look at my assault weapon ban? He was like, sure, give it to me. I mean, and I think it's fine. This is the thing, is people get so angry when I'm not black and white on Donald Trump's Second Amendment. Mm-hmm. And I tell you, I've been covering him and talking to him personally for 11 years. And I can say it's okay because he was so solid on the Supreme Court and getting conservative justices that we have a Bruen decision. And the Bruen decision makes much bigger of a difference than anything he said haphazardly in the Oval Office,
without
or
a doubt,
even what he really cares about.
Right. I agree completely. It's like people say, well, would you vote for him? If I had to, and if that was my choice against any Democrat, and I literally mean that, against any Democrat, yes, I would. Would he be my choice? No. But if he's the candidate, then yeah, you got to go there.
And people still upset about the pistol brace issue. Look, I think people get in the weeds on this with Donald Trump. The big picture is the Bruen decision is landmark. All of these other laws, I'm going to bet the assault weapons ban gets overturned before it gets Supreme Court. I mean, everything, carry permits are in every state now. I mean, it has changed landmark, and it'll be for decades.
All right, Emily, I'm just running out of time, and what you do is so good, and your reporting is so excellent. Tell people how they can see more of it, if you would.
Thank you. My Substack is emilypostnews.com. Sign up for free. Almost all of my content is free, and my paid subscribers support me. No ads, no spam. And Emily Miller on Twitter, Emily Miller DC on Facebook. Thanks.
There you go, emilypostnews.com. Emily, thank you so much. We're going to do it again, and we never have enough time. Thank you.
No.
You take care. All righty, 866-TALK-GUN. What's your take, your thoughts, and what have you been shooting? Oh, yeah, I did a little shooting recently. I'll tell you about it.